Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews. You know the routine. Today we're going to do some reviews. It's been a while since we've done any reviews, and it's now October, and September, one of the busiest months I can ever remember. There was the preparation to go to Paris, there was the trip itself, all the videos, there was the launch of the club room, the memberships. Remember, if you haven't joined us, only $4.99 a month and you get an exclusive video every week. And of course, there's the regular videos on top of that for everybody. So do join, and people are loving it at the moment. There's lots of sort of exclusive insider stuff in there. I'm often bringing special guests, which is quite good fun actually. And the reading has, I wouldn't say it's got behind, it's just been a bit more stately and leisurely. And of course, I caught that dreadful cold about 7 weeks ago, which I still have the odd cough. And you know, it's just like, it's old man bookseller, as they say. So it is what it is. So what have I been reading of late? Well, most recently I've been reading some non-fiction. So I'm not going to cover that. I'm just going to talk about the fiction that I've been reading and rereading, because the time has come when one of my retirement plans, which is some years off, is to sort of reread sort of all sort of classic things, which I love. But I found that because of the channel, I'm doing a lot of the SF now. So because often I look at other channels and they're doing stuff which I did decades ago, and it's great to see those books, you know, getting new life and what have you as people discover them. But I've often forgotten what the details were. So I am rereading. So we'll do one reread today, but various other things. And of course, you will have noticed recently that I've been on a total Eric Brown kick. And yes, there is going to be more Eric Brown. There is a book haul coming up next week, yes, and I know I'm not collecting, but there's going to be a book haul, a small one, and there'll be a fair amount of Eric Brown in it probably. But I did mention on a video a while ago that I was reading The Kings of Eternity, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I finished this before I went to Paris. When I go on holiday, I don't actually read when I'm on holiday, because I'm too busy doing other things and I take a break from it. So I didn't take any books with me apart from a guidebook to help sort of the planning and what have you. And I finished this and I read it over about 3 or 4 days, and I wanted to re-roll it over the eyeballs and savor it. And I have to say, of all of Eric's books I've read, I think this is the best one. And I've probably read a dozen or so now. He wrote loads and loads and loads. And I do find him very much a comfortable read. I'm not going to say cozy, because that has certain connotations, but he is a comfortable read for me. I turn to him when I'm not in the mood for anything like really challenging conceptually or style-wise. So that's not to downgrade him. He is really good. This is very smooth and literary. When I started to read it, it reminded me of The Prestige, purely because it's set in 2 different time periods, with 2 men who have the same surname, and instantly your head starts ticking over. And also the earlier thread is set in the 1930s, and the later thread is set sort of late 20th century. And both these men are writers. One of them becomes a writer, and there's clearly some connection between them. And the 1930s thread, one of them goes to see a friend who lives in a big country house, and he says that if you go out into the woods a certain time of the night, this void, this kind of singularity has been opening up, and he's fascinated by it. And they get another friend along who is also a writer, and he seemed to me to be based on Olaf Stapleton to a degree. He writes SF, but he's like a literary SF writer, and he's outside genre SF. And this has all the tropes that we know and love. I'm not going to tell you what they are because I don't want to give the game away, but it's very smooth and literary. Like Eric's books, all of Eric's books, it's really good on human relationships. And this one apparently took him 10 years to write, and you can tell that he crafted this very carefully. And for me, it's easily his best and most satisfying novel I've read thus far. And I have plenty more to read, as I say, but I really enjoyed this. So I think if you want to try Eric Brown, and like I say, a lot of them are quite light, and they mind candy, like for example the Telemas Quartet, which I read ages ago, and the Starship Seasons sequence, which I talked about a while ago. I read those. You know, the sort of things you read just when I read those things at Christmas when I'm really busy at work and I can't focus on anything too challenging. I did that with the Murderbot books a few years ago. I read, you know, this probably about 5 years ago, and I read 4 of them, and they're just mind candy, you know. But this is really quite something. This is his best claim to literary SF. and it's very warm and humane. It's got a great thread which is set on a Greek island, and I really love that, but it's not without its excitement, and it's a very, very well crafted novel indeed. And it's the sort of book that you could probably give to somebody who's never read any SF, they read mainstream novels, and sort of ease them in. And there are kind of nods to sort of pre-Golden Age things like E. Doc Smith in this, I found as well, which you'll discover when you read it. I'm not going to tell you any more about it, but it's a great book. Kings of Eternity. If you only buy one Eric Brown, based on what I've read, I'd say buy that one. It's lovely. So I've got more Eric coming because I did have a bit of a binge on him. So I always have a pile ready when I have that Eric mood. Speaking of rereading, I was going to do a video about John Sladek, and I am going to do one. And I decided it was time to reread one. And then I realised that since I've been collecting Sladek quite a lot the last couple of years, picking up peripheral things, I've now got more to read than I've actually read, so I need to read some more. But I went back to this, The Muller-Fokker Effect, which is a second novel from the late 60s, 1970, I think. And I've got a hardcover first, and I've also got this nice panther. And I had to put it down because at the time it would have been quite the thing. And it says on the cover, this and only this is the genuine novel for our times, accept no substitute. And to a degree that would have been true, or the publishers have been hoping that. And in the jacket of the hardcover, there's even more stuff like that. And this in a way is a proto-cyberpunk novel. It's about a guy whose consciousness is downloaded using a kind of magnetic tape into a computer. And that similar things have been done before, but this is a step toward it. Now Sladek is very like early Vonnegut. He's a little bit more slapdash and slapstick, I would say, than Vonnegut. He doesn't have that vein of old fartism, as Vonnegut himself said. He does satirize bureaucracy, systems, what have you, those sort of things, and the increasing cybernetization, as it were, of the contemporary world as it was then, as the modern world as it was then, as things were becoming more systematic in the post-war period, industrial theories, management theories, which are predicted by 1984, and Burnham, who inspired parts of Orwell's 1984, are in this. And he satirizes those things. That was a big part of his work. But at the same time, there's a level of chaos in this, which is controlled to a degree, but unless you focus really tightly on it, does tend to become rather irksome. And I have to say, I found this quite irksome, so I put it down because I think I wasn't in the right frame of mind. I am in two minds about Sladek. I'm going to talk about my favourite one when we do a video about him, which is a book called TikTok. Most people go for the reproductive system, or mechasm as it was in Dore, but he is an acquired taste. What I would say that I feel utterly unabashed about recommending is a work of recursive SF by him called The Steam-Driven Boy, which is a collection of short stories in which he parodies the style of lots of famous SF writers, and he does it absolutely brilliantly. This is a man who understands language entirely, and his parodies of people like Dick and Wells and many, many others are absolutely spot on, it has to be said. And of course, for a while there was a missing page in the manuscript of PKD's Lies Inc., The Unteleported Man, and Sladek wrote the linking section, and you can't see the join. But he is difficult, and he is an acquired taste. So I'll go back to him when I've read some of the ones I haven't read, some which are crime novels, and we'll talk a bit more about him. But he remains a one-off. Then, what else did I read? This is a book which I picked up. I did a book haul a few months ago when I'd done 15 years in my current company, and they gave me a £200 gift card, which is nice. And that translates into a lot more money for me. And this is The Stone Tide by Gareth E. Rees. Now, this is a work of fiction, okay? And yet it has a subtitle there, Adventures at the End of the World. Now, that is a distinct marker of a non-fiction book, okay? It says fiction on it. It's published by Influx Press. Influx do lots of great work. They were started by Gary Budden. I did a video about Gary Budden's work a few months ago called My New Favourite Author. Unfortunately, Gary's only produced a couple of books himself, lots of bits and pieces, and he's got Influx. And he also published the first Eliza Clark book, Boy Parts, which I reviewed as well, which I loved. And Gareth E. Rees, I read a book by him a few years back called Unofficial Britain, And it's all about car parks, the spaces below pylons, all those sort of forgotten liminal space, edgeland, otherwhere areas, thin places that, you know, exist in quasi-urban Britain. And there's several parts that were set locally in Bristol, which is just a few miles from me. And near the IKEA there's a dual carriageway, a trunk road we used to call them, a mini motorway, which bisected a road. And you can go down that road and it comes to a dead end, it stops. And at the other side, the road, so it literally cut this road in part. The two halves exist separate from each other. And it was a really good book. And unlike a lot of these psychogeography things, it was very witty and light, but not lacking in brains either. It was really refreshing. So I got this, and I've got a collection of short stories by him as well. And this is supposedly a novel. However, as far as I'm concerned, this is autobiography. And it has a little endorsement there from M. John Harrison. And Mike says, the funniest, most readable, most intelligently self-searching book I've read in years. Now, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Rhys is probably influenced by M. John Harrison, because M. John is really good at writing about the little quirky, messy details of life that surround us. And Gareth is good at this as well. And this is about a first-person narrative of a writer who moves to Hastings with his wife. They've got 2 young daughters. They buy this house, which is impossibly run down. And the classic thing happens, which you get when you get an artist living with somebody who isn't an artist, and it's a bit of an issue, is that he is trying to work out how to write his next book. And it's going to be about Hastings, which is a seaside town in the southeast of Britain, for those of you who are not in the UK. And Christopher Priest lived there for a long time, interestingly. And he decides to write this book, which somehow is going to bring together certain, can we say, cultural icons? Interesting edge figures, we'll say. A Leicester Crowley, the magician, who everybody's heard of, you know, to the level of cliche. I mean, from now on, I don't think any writer should even mention Crowley. He's so overexposed. He lived there at the very end of his life when he was a heroin addict in the late 40s. John Logie Bard, who invented television, lived there. And also the guy, I think his name's something Dawson, who came up with the Piltdown Man forgery as well, where he took the jaw of an orangutan and the upper skull of the cranium, I should say, of a human being, and claimed they were the same fossil, and he did some filing. And it fooled people for decades. So he's going to try and pull these things together. It's also a meditation about his dead friend, Mike, who's mentioned a lot in this. And this is basically an autobiography with some fictional vignettes in it. And it's not that it's bad. I mean, it's very, very well written indeed. And it has some really funny bits. And Gareth is funny, including chapter 5, which is entitled The Eel with a Head the Size of an Armchair. The eel with a head the size of an armchair. And what's more, there's a drawing in here of the eel with a head the size of an armchair. So there it is. If you can see that, you notice that his head is shaped like an armchair. There you go. That's obviously an armchair from the club room of Outlaw Bookseller. And you can gradually see as his relationship, you can sort of predict it's going to fall apart. The main problem with this book is that even though it's got some wonderful flights of lyricism in it, is that it's just plain too long. It's 355 odd pages, and it just doesn't hold the attention. If you've read a lot of psychogeography, weird fiction, things like M. John Harrison, Joel Lane, Arthur Machen, all those sort of things, it just doesn't pull in enough. Is it horror? Not really. There's flashes of it. There's flashes of the fantastic. But really, this is an autobiography of a man searching to write the book and finding the book he's writing just out of what he's doing day by day. And it's just pulling a book together, which I can see why M. John Harrison liked it in that respect. It's very, very much the sort of thing where it's slices of life. And it reminded me of something that Mike said, where a editor said to him, they went to lunch, and he talks about this in Wish I Was Here, his last book. And the editor said, oh, you know, you've got a really good, your new book is like it's a really good novel trying to scream it to get out, except the author's getting in the way, or the author isn't pulling it together. And it's that sort of thing. And you found, you know, Mike saw that as praise. And I think Gareth took it rather too far. If this had been 250 pages, 300, even at 300, I think it was a stretch, because relying on occasionally sort of flashing up the names Crowley, what have you, John Logie Band, it's not enough. We've seen too much of that kind of writing. If you're going to do that sort of thing, you've got to really sort of make it compelling. And that's where the novel House of Rumour by Jake Arnott really, really works, because it's a proper novel. This is an autobiography. It has kind of put me off. I'm at the stage now where I'm thinking, if I read 2 books by somebody and I like one and not the other, I've had this experience a lot. You read a book by somebody and you love it, then you buy the next 3. And by the time you get around to read them, you realise that they're a one-book author. And it's quite an interesting thing. I'm trying to develop my instinct of who is a one-book author. I don't mean they're a one-book author for everybody. I mean they're a one-book author for me. And that's certainly the case with Tom McCarthy, who wrote Remainder, one of my favourite books from the last 25 years. Other things I've read of him just haven't done it. They've tried too hard. So Gareth, you and I might be parting the ways. But if you like that sort of thing, if you live in Hastings, you should probably read it in that neck of the woods. So, a reread. Before I went to Paris, I was thinking I'd do a film there based around a place which is on the left bank at Quai Malaquais, which is called Hotel Transylvania. Well, it was called Hotel Transylvania. It's nothing to do with the film. The film has borrowed the title from this novel, which, as you see, is Hotel Transylvania by Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough. This is the first in her 30-novel Saint-Germain Vampire series, and they are the best historical horror novels you will ever read. You will rarely read historical horror anyway. What Chelsea really is in these, she does all sorts of things. She's done westerns, SF, New Age books, all kinds of stuff, kids books. She's very talented. This came out in the late 70s. This was the year after Interview with the Vampire, so she was probably writing it while that was just being finished off. And as much as I love Interview with the Vampire, even though this isn't as good, collectively, her body of work across these books just makes mincemeat of Anne Rice, who very swiftly went off the boil. And the reason why I was going to this place, which is called Hotel Transylvania, it's got a complex history, but I'll tell you about it. Back in the, I think it was the late 18th century, there was a Transylvanian Hungarian prince called Ferenc Ragoski, and he was the second of his line. And he basically had been involved in some war with Spain, and it had sort of broke him money-wise. So he bought this house, and at that point of us, he said hotel meant, it a circumflex over the O, basically meant a house, so it was Transylvania House. So he went there and he used to have like a gambling salon there, and his hope was that he would win lots of money and get his fortune back. It didn't turn out that way. So Yarbrough takes that, and she also takes a very mysterious figure who appeared about 30 years later called the Comte de Saint-Germain. He was self-styled, and the Comte de Saint-Germain was really quite famous at the time, and he was around the courts of Europe for about 30 years, and I think 1743 he appeared, and he seems to have a connection to Ragoski because she conflates the two characters fictionally in this book and its many sequels. Fundamentally, the Comte de Saint-Germain used to wear black and white in a time when people dressed like pastel peacocks. It was incredible. And the descriptions of the clothing in this period are just, you realise people wore amazing stuff. If you know anything about the Sun King, Versailles, that period in French history before the Revolution, the aristocrats were total dandies. You think of the New Romantics. I mean, they did that a long, long time before. And fundamentally, he dressed in black and white. He was quite short and small. He was ambidextrous. He could write the same thing with both hands on different pieces of paper at the same time, and they'd look the same signature, what have you. Nobody ever saw him eat or drink. He claimed to never eat or drink. He also claimed to be at least 3,000 years old and say that he was immortal. He's a very clever man. He used to write music. He wrote an alchemical tract. He claimed to be an alchemist. Frederick the Great was a big fan, I think. Also, the King of France spent a lot of time with him. And there's this rumour that basically he acted as a courier or a spy for different European courts. And then he died, but there are eyewitness accounts of people who received letters from him or saw him afterwards, up to 30 years afterwards, and he never looked any different. So what Yarbrough did, she combined these two things. So I was going to go to the real Hotel Transylvania, which I thought I'd found once before, and I thought it was on the Boulevard de Saint-Germain, which makes sense, but it wasn't. So I found the location, but because things went pear-shaped the second day I was in Paris in terms of timing, I didn't really get to film outside, even though we walked past there very quickly. It's a boutique now, and I really wanted to go there, so I will go back next time. But I reread this as a taster. Now, Chelsea's books are mostly print on demand or ebooks these days, which is a shame, because she seems to have lost her deal with Tor. She's in her early 80s. She hasn't had a proper book out since about 10 years. And I just swallow these up. And from about 2009 to 2014, I read all of them. And I really, really love these books. They helped me through some very difficult times. And they're fundamentally incredibly well-researched historical novels. In terms of chronology, they zip about across time, back and forth. So you'll get this one set in 18th century France. The second one is set in the Florence of the Medicis. The third one is set in Nero's Rome, and so on. They zip around. You can read them as it doesn't make any difference, because what she does is research the history really intensively, and she's written history books as well, which are really good. And Saint Germain is not your typical vampire. He is wise, philosophical, he holds himself back, he rarely engages in acts of violence or kills people. But what you get in this is you get a picture across human history of how oppressive religion has been in particular, particularly Christianity. And, you know, so when things happen that are dramatic, they have massive, massive impact. They're not like packed with incident. And he basically visits women in their dreams, takes a small amount of their blood and gives them intense sensual pleasure. And they think they're dreaming, but he's actually sort of, you know, doing what a man must do, except of course being a vampire he cannot commit the act of love, so it's something else which I won't go into. But they're wonderful, wonderful books. I regard them as literature. They're fantastic. I did a video about them at the beginning of the channel. I'm going to do an extensive one at some point, but I would say if you see any of them, pick them up and give them a go, because they're really classy reads. And this is the third time I've read this. This one's different to the others. She hasn't quite found her feet, but in this there's a wonderful sort of conflict between Saint Germain and a band of Satanists who've been promised this girl from the moment she was born, and there's a lot of gambling and debt in it. So it does go back to the original prince who, you know, founded the entire idea, as it were. Great stuff. I got 2 different copies of that. I love that book, and I'd love to meet her. I think she's a fantastic writer. Anyway, then this is probably one of the best books, if not the best book I've read this year. And this is a writer I like, but I was taken aback by this. This is Annihilation by Michel Houellebecq. I suppose I call him Houellebecq because I'm British and I'm Welsh. I can't speak French. When I went, God, I realised how bad my French was. So Houellebecq, call it what you will. Annihilation. Now he wrote Submission, which is one of my favourite SF novels of the 21st century. He's published as a writer of general fiction. He's not a genre writer in terms of marketing and packaging. His other SF novel is The Possibility of an Island, which I thought was rather uneven, though there might have been problems with translations. Iggy Pop did an album based on it, actually, called Preliminares. So a quasi-concept album. This is Annihilation. Yes, it's got the same title as the Jeff Vandermeer book. There's no copyright on titles. You know, in a few years somebody else will do that. Also, this is French. This was published in 2022 in France, and over here this year, just a few weeks ago, 2024. It's set in 2027. So nominally, it's a science fiction novel. It's published by Picador, and as you see, I've covered it because it's got like a rubbery jacket, and I just love this cover. And the beauty of this was that I went into it, having read several of his novels, thinking I knew what to expect, but at the same time knowing that he often throws a curveball. And fundamentally, this upset all my expectations, and it absolutely delighted me. When it opens with a sequence which is about 2 guys who are hackers. And that says 2027. So it's 5 years after it was written. It's set in Paris, in France, of course. And so it's a few years from now. So even by doing that, the writer is immediately saying this is set in the future because there have been some changes, and we'll come on to that in a moment. So there's these 2 hackers, and they basically have this interview with the French government, with some aspect of the French government, and the interview is basically like an exam. They show how quickly they can break through firewalls and what have you, and hack into systems and things, and then they become employees of the government. So it starts a bit like a William Gibson book, so probably more like the Blue Ant books than, say, Neuromancer and what have you. So you're expecting to go that way. The cast gradually widens out, and the real issue is these guys are set to work on a cyber attack, and it's one of a series of cyber attacks which are popping up at random, and they're very unusual, and they involve, when the cyber attacks come and systems are damaged, these videos pop up, and they will often contain these mysterious symbols and impenetrable characters, and there are several of them, and each one is different, and the attacks begin to threaten figures who are prominent in French politics. And then this goes off, it doesn't go to tangent, it just gradually swells. And we're introduced to a guy called Bruno, who eats a lot of pizza, doesn't have much of a life outside his office. He's high up in the government, and he's quite diffident, and he's beginning to develop an interest in maybe going up for election. And he works with a guy called Paul, and Paul gradually emerges as the focus character. Paul and Bruno have got quite a lot in common. They basically live at the office. They don't have much of a life outside that. They're estranged from their sort of partners and families and what have you. Paul is married. He hasn't had a proper relationship with his wife for years and years and years. And it follows the path down into Paul's relationships. And in the background, and every now and again, these cyber attacks pop up, and they're getting stranger, more diffuse. Nobody can pin down who might be doing them. One of them might be from the right. One might be from Christians, which is unlikely. They start to think maybe they come from outer space, and they start to form this strange web around the narrative, and they begin to get you thinking about things like the Gibson Blue Ant trilogy. And what happens is we see this crisis come upon Paul when his father has a stroke, and the family have to rally around, and you get to know the family. His sister is an intense Catholic who's married to a notary who's lost his job in northern France. There's a lot of unemployment in northern France. And it's just amazing. And he begins to sort of see more of his wife, and the web of characters spreads out. And there are a number of shocks in this, which I wasn't expecting. But the biggest thing of all was that it didn't do what I expected as a mainstream novel that appears to be using and entering the territory of the SF novel. And in that way, it's a perfect boundary between the two things. And it had a massive emotional impact on me. But the thing about this, I used the word diffident earlier on, is that Welbeck is never, he's always diffident. He is often described as being right-wing and dour and sexist and all those things. And as I always say, the trouble is people tend to conflate a character's voice or implications of a character's voice or situation in novels with the writer themselves, and you can't always say that. And yeah, he is a bit of a nihilist. I mean, he wrote a book about H.P. Lovecraft called Against the World, Against Life, which is possibly the best book title ever. And I'm somebody who's like, I'm so over Lovecraft, it isn't true, but I did enjoy that book, but Against the World, Against Life. And his last book is a book called Serotonin, and that was a lot about sex tourism and antidepressants and what have you. People take a lot of drugs in them and stuff, and medical problems. And this goes into medicine in an incredibly brave and unflinching way. But the real beauty, as I say, is the diffidence. This is a mature, sophisticated writer who doesn't have to go into hand-wringing, doesn't have to go into the romantic end of tragedy, doesn't have to underline and overemphasize people's emotions. He merely depicts people getting on with life. There's quite a focus on sex, and the thing is, he puts that in not because it's prurient, and he's quite direct about it, because it's an important part of life for people, whether they have lots of it, none of it, or somewhere in between, whether they're conflicted about it or not. And that's a major thing. So he comments a lot on the body in this. So the combination of what could be seen as a domestic family drama, high French politics, advanced cyber attacks, and there are flashes of things which Lovecraft would recognize as well, maybe from supernatural fiction, but I'm going to tell you because I want you to read it. But this is possibly the best book I've read all year. But at the end of it, was I disappointed? Well, actually, yes, I was disappointed initially, But then I realized the reason why I was disappointed was because it didn't do what I expected it to do, and it didn't do what I wanted it to do. I wanted it to do something neat where I could wrap it up and say, as an SF novel, this is this. But this is not an SF novel, and neither is a mainstream novel. It's something else. It's something bold. In that sense, it reminds me of China Mountain Zhang by Maureen F. McHugh, which is probably the first science fiction novel I can remember reading way back in the 90s, which has a proper Mrs. Brown character, as Ursula Le Guin put it, about Philip K. Dick's Tagomi and the Man in the High Castle. This is about real people. And yeah, they're mostly well off or well heeled, but they have real problems. And it's about the big question. This is what the book is really about. It's about the big question that confronts us all and really underlines and powers everything we do or think, whether we're aware of it or not. But we grow more aware of it as we get older, and its significance doesn't go away. It isn't romantic. It is tragic. It's diffident. It's that coolness, and it's not the kind of coolness. It's not the detached thing. It's not trying. This book doesn't try too hard, and that's why it succeeds. And there's a lot of writers could take a leaf out of this book and work at these things and try and depict the stuff it depicts in a way which is apparently without passion on the surface, but is actually deeply affecting and moving, but in a way which is as intellectual as it is emotive. I can't really say enough good about it, even though, as I say, I was initially disappointed. But the lead up to the final point, I was thinking there's going to be a payoff, and there wasn't the payoff I thought. There was a payoff, and it was very beautiful and very considered and very important for anybody who's a humanist, anybody who believes that the novel has a future. The novel has a future when it's in the hands of writers like this. That's all I have to say for now. I've talked far longer than I meant to. There's a lot going on still. I'm not sure if there'll be another video this week. I hope so. I'm hoping to get back to normal. There's been just so much happening since I did Paris and come back, trying to get everything on board. And I cancelled my holiday to Amsterdam because I decided that, one, it probably would be a good idea financially. Secondly, I didn't really want to go. We booked it in a hurry. We got the refund back. We've got lots to do. So that week, it's really meant to be, that week I booked to be my week when I kick back before it gets really busy for me at work for Christmas. So that week, I'm just going to stay at home and make some videos for you guys, really. That's a few weeks off. So, we'll gradually build things back up on the SF there. But I need to switch off now because I've got things to do and I need to get reading some more SF. Hope you enjoyed that. And if you buy one hardback non-genre novel this year, buy Annihilation. Thanks a lot, guys. See you soon.